Good morning, church. This is Pastor Marty. I have Tina making faces at me in the background, so I'll do my best to keep a straight face. We have the opportunity to look at some scriptures this morning, both from the Old Testament, Psalms and Jeremiah, and then a look at a gospel passage. Let me talk just real briefly about the Old Testament passages. They're hard ones to listen to. These are not feel-good passages. These are passages where God is revealing his frustration and his hurt, that God is offering to us a place at his table, that he wants to give to us. He wants to bless us. He wants us to have life and have it abundantly. And yet, we find other things to pay attention to. Our hearts turn away and we say, no, we're not interested, and we go elsewhere. And so the Psalms passage and the Jeremiah passage speak very clearly of God's hurt feelings about his desire to be in relationship with us and his desire for us to be in relationship with him. But now we come to the passage in Luke, and this particular passage deals with two main ideas. We have humility and we have charity. And I think to kick that off, I'll begin just by telling a story. You'd be disappointed if I didn't tell you a story. That once upon a time, at the company whose name I will not mention, there was a person who was working after hours. It used to be that the regional office would close at 4:15, and if the phone rang at 4:16, you weren't expected to answer the phone. And this one kind individual decided to show an act of charity and answered the phone on a Friday afternoon at 4:20. And when he picked up the phone, he immediately heard that the caller was an agent who was very, very difficult to deal with. He was arrogant. He was rude. He treated everybody as if they worked for him and had no kindness or regard for them. And on top of that, he was connected to the regional office leadership. So nobody felt like that they could even criticize him because he was connected to leadership. And he knew that, and he acted very rudely because of it. And he expected this man to drop everything at that particular hour and do something absolutely unreasonable and way beyond the call of duty. And the person explained, we'll gladly take care of this next week, but we're not able to help you now. To which the agent very gruffly said, do you know who I am? And the man paused for a moment and he said, well, do you know who I am? And the agent gruffed it. He said, of course I don't know who you are. And the man said, good. And he hung up the phone and he went home for that weekend. Well, not much charity there on either side. We started with charity, and certainly no humility on the part of the caller. And when we look at this passage in Luke, we see that Jesus is brought in to a home for a meal. And it's a meal on the Sabbath. And so because it's on the Sabbath, this means that all of the food has already been prepared so as to not break the rules of the Sabbath. But listen carefully to how verse 1 ends, that they may watch him closely. He was not invited to this meal so that he could be honored for being a great teacher or to be listened to or to be engaged in. He was invited to a trap. And I think the trap was purposely set that this person was going to show, look, I'm obeying the rules of the Sabbath. I'm not having anything prepared. I'm not doing any work. And lo and behold, who does this person invite but someone who has an illness? We believe it to be dropsy. And the first 6 and 7 verses of that chapter have to do with Jesus healing once again on the Sabbath. I won't spend much time talking about that because it's not our reading, and also because I talked about Jesus healing on the Sabbath on August 25th, last Sunday. It's important to know that Jesus did heal approximately 7 or 8 times throughout Scripture on the Sabbath. So he made a point to show that it is always better to do good than to follow some man-made religion and some man-made rules that the Pharisees were very well known for following. So now that he has healed this person, you can imagine that the room is just boiling. They are angry. They're like, he did it again. He broke the Sabbath. And so now Jesus begins to tell a story, and he has a purpose for telling that story. And the story is just very simply, if you go to a wedding feast, where do you sit? In those days, the seats of honor were determined by the proximity to the couple or to the people that are throwing the feast. And so the closer that you sat with them, the closer that you were perceived to be of importance, the more important that you were, the more of esteem, the more uppity up that you are. And Jesus tells these people that when you're invited, it's far better to take the lesser seat, to sit in back, and to allow these people to invite you to come forward than to sheepishly be shooed out of a seat that's being given to someone of a higher ranking than you. Have you ever gone to a baseball game and you got your tickets wrong and you're in the wrong seat and then the people come and it just feels awkward to have to get to move? How much more so when you see yourself in such a light that you place yourself in what you think is the proper place of order, only to be publicly shown that's not correct. And so Jesus talks very much about taking the lower seat. Here's where it gets interesting, is when we think about humility. You know, humility, and I put this quote in specially for country folk here. Humility is like underwear. We should have it, but we shouldn't let it show. I'm giving you time to laugh. I thought it was funny, okay? But humility is something that it should be so natural that we just don't even realize that we have it. I think of a wonderful story that I have here before me of a missionary by the name of Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor was a tremendous missionary in China. He accomplished many wonderful things. And written about him is this particular story that speaks well of his humility. It said that Taylor was scheduled to speak at a large Presbyterian church, and the moderator of the service introduced the missionary in eloquent and glowing terms. He told the large congregation that Taylor had accomplished so much in China, and that he is our most illustrious guest to be with us this evening. Taylor stood quietly for a moment, dumbfounded by such an introduction, and then opened his message by saying, "Dear friends, I am but a little servant of an illustrious master." What a wonderful, wonderful attitude to have. I remember some years ago being involved in something in a children's ministry, and a very high-ranking individual within that ministry came and visited our church. And I watched as a young child asked him, because they didn't recognize him, he was there, and they said, "Who are you?" And he got down on his hands and knees and pointed to a badge, because we all wore uniforms with ribbons and badges and stuff. And he said, "You see that? I'm the top guy." And I just never really thought that was a good way to answer that question. We are to be humble. We're to be people that aren't so full of ourselves that we can't be filled with the Spirit of God. Martin Luther tells this about pride and about how humans can often be. He said he told the story of two mountain goats who met each other on a narrow cliff just wide enough for one of the animals to pass. On the left was a sheer cliff, and on the right a steep wall. The two were facing each other, and it was impossible to turn or back up. How did they solve their dilemma? If they had been people, they would have started butting one another until they plunged into the chasm together. But, according to Luther, the goats had more sense than that. One of them laid down on the trail and literally let the other walk over him, and both were safe. So, I remember one time in a sermon I told you to be like a pig. Now I'm telling you to be like a goat. Humility is expected of guests, and charity is expected of hosts. And that's really what this passage teaches. The first part of the passage is about humility. The second part is about charity. So we are to have charity when we are host. And that's where Jesus begins with the teaching of when you give a dinner, don't think about inviting people who can repay you. Or when you do a good deed, don't think of somebody who can properly thank you. Instead, ask for the people who can't repay you, because then you are truly doing a deed of charity. You are acting in the true spirit of God when we do that. And I think that that's probably a little bit of a dig also back to the owner of this house that threw this party, because he's probably thinking, not only am I setting a trap, but maybe I'll get Jesus indebted to me, because I've now seen him heal on the Sabbath. And Jesus goes on and teaches about humility. He teaches about charity. I continue to be moved by churches that have really grasped what it means, not only to be humble in their service, but also to be absolutely full of charity in their service. I think of Royal Oak United Methodist, who in the face of all kinds of marketing positions that were given to them. This is a church that at one point had 2,000 people flow through in a weekend, and now it was down to 300. And so people and consultants began to come in, and they said, well, you need to start looking at targeting millennials, or you need to start looking to target a particular group and devise your advertising and your ministry to that group to try to get them in. And they said, we think you're half right. We will target a group, but we're not going to do it through marketing. We're going to do it through prayer. And their prayer was simply this: hey, God, send us all of the folks that no one else wants. And by golly, they've gotten them. And what a wonderful and powerful mission and ministry is taking place at this church. They've nearly doubled their attendance. And they continue to be a message of love and grace and ministry. And they also find themselves in the midst of the poor and in the midst of the downtrodden. Royal Oak United Methodist, I applaud you for what you've done. I think that is very much in keeping with the spirit of this passage. But I also do want to just give an example of a nearby church, of a ministry that I think is, again, fantastic. And it's our brothers and sisters ministering out of the Williamston United Methodist Church. They do an open table on Wednesday nights. It's open to the community. It's a free dinner. And it gives people the opportunity to meet and to minister. And if you have money that you can make a donation, great. If you don't, great. And they even have food available for people to take. Tina and I visited there, and we were really touched by the humble and the charitable and the hospitality, the humble and charitable spirit and the hospitality that we were shown there. It was a great and it was a wonderful ministry, and it continues to this day. In fact, I encourage you, go visit it sometime. See for yourself what that is like. I believe they go from 5:30 to 6:30 or 7. Check it out. But when you go, you will see that the many in the audience, that meal makes a difference in their budget. And that was really moving, and that was really, really touching to see that. And so let us stop and think for a moment. How do we view ourselves? Are we willing to be humble? Are we also willing to not look for glory, but to look to be faithful? Are we willing to serve those that God is telling us to serve? Or do we instead have a heart that wants something else? A heart like those in the Psalms, a heart like those in Jeremiah, who choose to do things in a way that isn't the way that God has asked them to do. I almost think that these Old Testament passages were paired with the reading in Luke so that we might also ask of ourselves, I wonder where in the banquet of my life, what seat do I give God? And should I be having God move up in a seat of higher honor? We are on our way to where the Apostle James is reported to be buried. So it would only be appropriate if I quote to you some passages on these themes from the book of James. Because James talks about humility and he talks about charity. So let's start with just on humility. For those of you who take notes, I'm just quoting from James chapter 4, verses 6 and verses 10. God gives more grace, but he resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. And then verse 10, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. We don't need to fuss and to fight and to rancor and to try to get ourselves into a higher position. We just need to be faithful to God, and God will take care of the rest.
Amen.
And with respect to how we view others, James talks so much in chapter 2 about favoritism. And he talks about if somebody comes and they're in fancy clothes, do you give them the best seat? And if somebody comes and they're They're obviously poor and destitute. Do you just let them sit somewhere in the corner? And James is, you've got it all wrong. Chances are it's the person in the great clothes that's going to be the one trying to drag you to court, where it's the other person that's going to bless God because you were kind and you showed love to them. So, brothers and sisters, let us take these scriptures and reflect on humility. Let us reflect on charity. Let us ask ourselves, have we invited God to the seat of honor in our life? Do we partake of what God wishes for us to share? And are we willing to let God call the shots? Once upon a time, there was a book that came out written by a World War II pilot, and everybody loved it, and it said, God is my co-pilot. And then the light went off, and it was like, oh no, God should be the pilot. You should be the co-pilot. I'd like to leave you with a story that I think gives great perspective about humility and about charity. This is what I aspire to, and I hope that you aspire to it as well. If you can start the day without caffeine, if you can always be cheerful, ignoring aches and pains, if you can resist complaining and boring people with your troubles, if you can eat the same food every day and be grateful for it, if you can understand when your loved ones are too busy to give you any time, if you can take criticism and blame without resentment, if you can resist treating a rich friend better than a poor friend, if you can face the world without lies and without deceit, if you can overlook it when those you love take it out on you, when through no fault of yours something goes wrong, if you can conquer tension without medical help, if you can honestly say deep in your heart that you have no prejudice against creed, color, religion, or politics, well, brothers and sisters, then you are almost as good as your dog. May we learn from that example, and may we allow the love of God to flow through us. Brothers and sisters, Tina and I look so forward to being with you soon. God bless you.